Welcome to today's Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to be your teacher today as we tackle what is, honestly, one of the most magnificent puzzles in all of science, the tree of life. If you've ever looked out at the natural world, at the literally millions of different organisms crawling, swimming, and flying across our Earth, and wondered how biologists possibly make sense of it all, well, you are in the exact right place. Today we're going to explore how scientists classify life. We'll start from those foundational visual clues and zoom all the way down into the incredibly complex, high-tech world of DNA-based sequencing. It is a wildly fascinating journey, so get ready.
Here's our quick lesson plan for today's Explainer. First, we'll cover sorting the natural world. Next up, using a dichotomous key. Third, uncovering true evolutionary links. And finally, we'll wrap up with the DNA classification revolution.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Sorting the Natural World.
Okay, so before we zoom into the mind-bending complexities of genetics, we need to recognize that classification traditionally starts by grouping organisms based on obvious, shared physical features. It's just a highly practical way to start organizing the sheer chaos of nature. But as we get more and more specific with our groupings, we eventually hit the smallest, most specific level of classification. And this brings us to an absolute, fundamental rule in biology, the definition of a species. A species is a group of organisms that can reproduce to produce fertile offspring. Generally, members of the same species are almost identical in their anatomy, their physiology, and their behavior. But what's really interesting is how this applies to animals we see every single day, like house cats. Because of human intervention and selective breeding, a completely hairless Sphinx cat looks wildly different from a giant fluffy Persian cat. But biologically, they are the exact same species because they can breed together successfully.
Now, once biologists identify a species, it obviously needs a name. But it can't just be any name. It needs to be a name that's recognized flawlessly all over the entire world, regardless of local languages or dialects. This is exactly where the internationally agreed-upon binomial system comes into play. It's essentially a universal naming convention. Every scientific name is made up of two parts: the genus, which is a broader category of closely related species, and the specific species name itself. The rule here is simple but incredibly strict. The genus always starts with a capital letter, and the species always starts with a lowercase letter.
Let's look at the Felish genus to see how this works in the real world. There are exactly 7 species within this specific genus. 6 of them are small wild cats, and that 7th one is our familiar domestic cat, Felis catus. Now, these 7 distinct animals are incredibly closely related to one another, which is why they share that same genus. But they remain classified as completely individual, separate species because they cannot produce fertile offspring with one another. It's really just a perfect, elegant system for keeping the biological family tree organized.
And that brings us to Section 2, using a dichotomous key.
So, knowing the rules of classification is great in the classroom, but what happens when a biologist is actually out in the field and encounters an organism they've never seen before? They need a practical tool to identify it right then and there. Enter the dichotomous key. It's essentially a logical flowchart based on physical features, kind of like playing a giant game of Guess Who. To build one, we start by studying our group for commonalities. Then we ask a feature-based question to split them perfectly in two. And from there, we just keep drilling down with further subgroup questions until every single animal is entirely separated out. Let's use vertebrates, animals with a backbone, like birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, and fish as our test case.
Applying this to our vertebrates, we need a really strong first question. Asking, is it warm-blooded or cold-blooded, is honestly the perfect opening move. Immediately, this one Socratic question takes a massive, diverse group of animals and cleanly splits it right down the middle into 2 distinct subgroups. It's just incredibly efficient. From there, you look at your new subgroups and ask your next question. So for the cold-blooded subgroup, you might ask, does it have limbs? By asking this simple yes or no question, you instantly single out the fish from the reptiles and amphibians. And because the fish have now been completely isolated into their own category, boom, no further questions are needed for them on this branch of the key. You just continue this logical breakdown for the rest of the animals until everyone is identified.
But here is a really fun aside to keep in mind. This logical flowchart system isn't strictly reserved for living, breathing creatures. The beauty of a dichotomous key is its pure logic. You can use it to classify absolutely anything. In fact, chemistry and biology students often use dichotomous keys to successfully identify different types of laboratory glassware. A beaker, a flask, a test tube. You can sort the whole shebang just by asking a series of yes or no physical feature questions.
All right, let's shift gears now into our extended concepts with Section 3, Uncovering True Evolutionary Links. For a long time, we classified things based entirely on those outward looks we just talked about. But here is the incredible plot twist in biology. Bone structures actually reveal deep evolutionary relationships. Consider humans, lizards, bats, birds, and whales. Think about how completely different those animals are. Yet when you look beneath the skin, the arrangement and number of bones in their limbs is almost exactly the same across all five. A human arm, a bat's wing, and a whale's flipper literally share the exact same fundamental blueprint.
So why does this matter? Well, according to evolutionary theory, these structural similarities are a massive hint at a shared common ancestry. Think about it logically. These animals use their limbs for totally different tasks: running, flying, grasping, swimming. If these creatures were completely unrelated to one another, we would absolutely expect their bone structures to be drastically different to accommodate those specific tasks, right? The fact that they share the exact same bones means they inherited that physical structure from a common ancestor long, long ago.
However, and this is a big however, physical looks can sometimes be deceiving, which is why modern classification has to be so rigorous. A classic mix-up in biology involves the pangolin and the armadillo. For a time, they were mistakenly grouped together because they look so incredibly similar. They're both covered in those tough overlapping scales. But as we learned more, we realized their similar appearance wasn't due to a shared common ancestor at all. Their lack of a true evolutionary link meant their classification had to be completely separated. Nature just happened to solve the problem of defense in the exact same way for two completely unrelated animals.
Which beautifully sets up our final topic, Section 4, the DNA classification revolution.
When physical appearances deceive us, how do we find the absolute truth? We turn to the genetic code. As our source material emphatically states,